Chaos is a ladder. Actually, turns out it's a bipedal frog monster. Meet the Slaad. Hailing from the ever-changing chaos of Limbo, these outer planar denizens were the true living embodiment of neutral chaos. Having a particularly strange life cycle, the Slaad were another breed of alien cosmic horror, not too detached from our previously discussed Illithid friends. These batrachian creatures also made video game appearances in the Forgotten Realms Demon Stone, Dungeons & Dragons Online, and Neverwinter Nights, and we'll be looking at them a little bit closer today. Buckle up for a doozy of a deep dive, friends. Part 1. What are the Slaad? Have you ever wondered what the congealed form of sentient chaos looked like in the Forgotten Realms? Well, wonder no further, friends. It looks like a giant bipedal frog. With that answered, I guess we can all go home for the day now, right? Video's over, but only if it could be so simple. These batrachian horrors were the result of the counterintuitively imposed order on a disordered being. See, it all started with a guy named Igorl. A Slaad lord, in fact. What is a Slaad lord, you ask? Well, it's a Slaad deity, of course. But don't tell the Slaad that. Being followers of gods or religion is a little too lawful for their liking. In any case, this Slaad lord, Igorl, wanted to incite chaos across the realms. But the problem is, how do you enact chaos when chaos is inherently changing and formless? The answer was the spawning stone. With the addition of the spawning stone to Limbo, the Slaad would take the form of amphibian aberrations, and their randomness would in turn be somewhat stifled. This was all part of the grand design for Igorl, however, who needed the occasional minion capable of being manipulated into his bidding. While this did limit the chaotic potential of the Slaad, it also decreased the likelihood of a Slaad of comparable power to the Slaad lords ever forming in the ever-changing randomness of the chaos in Limbo. Nevertheless, it has been noted that through the very essence of chaos, there would still be the occasional deviation from the regular Slaad form. Gormeal, a lawful Slaad being perhaps the best example. In short, the very nature of chaos meant that the generation of a lawful creature was a statistical inevitability, and so, occasionally a Slaad would be born as the lawful Gormeal. But ew, lawful? We don't really need to go there. For now. Well, that's one theory anyway. The fact is, the origin of the nature of the Slaad is a little bit fuddled. A little enigmatic, or perhaps chaotic, one might say. The origin of the Slaad nature is in fact partly mystery, partly rumor, with many different theories being thrown around in a, well, chaotic debate as to their true origin. The Slaad were a particularly peculiar subject. Though their generally bipedal frog shape of medium stature was recognizable, they would come in every imaginable flavor, with extra limbs, organs, eyes, or whatever else you can imagine, sometimes coming into their forms. Vestigial appendages, wings, horns, or even changes in size to small, large, or gigantic sizes were not unheard of. The most powerful Slaad lord, Sendum, is perhaps the best example of how random the Slaad forms could be, appearing as a giant amoeba, though its coming into being predated the spawning stone, which greatly limited their forms. The Slaad also had many different races of varying power, associated with all the colors of the rainbow. We won't get too hung up on that for now, but it is worth mentioning simply to paint the picture. These Slaad types formed a loose hierarchy with different colors falling on different rungs of the ladder. They all had their places in the vicinity of the spawning stone, but how those places were determined was unknown to anyone but the Slaad. However, the spawning stone and surrounding chaos could be manipulated to create a suitable environment for each type of Slaad. With the spawning stone being the central point of existence for the Slaad, it also became inextricably linked to their complicated reproduction process, as well as a de facto Slaadi town. All the typical things associated with society could be found in the spawning stone town, including shops and humanoid chattel markets. Similarly to their aberrant cousins, the Illithid, Slaadi required a host in order to produce more Slaad, and in typical fashion, humanoid creatures from the prime material plane were one of the favored hosts. And not without good reason, as Slaad were able to polymorph into their former host's form at will, allowing them to sneak in and out around humanoid settlements in order to capture more unwilling hosts for their birthing process. Speaking of which, this brings us neatly to the next session of the video. Part 2. Slaad Life Cycle. As mentioned in the previous part, Slaad began their life similarly to the Illithid, and that was as tadpoles. But unlike the Illithid, the Slaad tadpole must be implanted via red Slaadi egg. The Slaad egg was stored in the subcutaneous glands under the claws of a red Slaad. On a successful scratch, a red Slaad would have a chance of implanting tiny egg pellets into the victims of their attacks. The egg would then gestate over a random period of as little as 3 hours or as much as several months. During the gestation period, the egg would move to the chest cavity of the victim, and 24 hours before hatching, the victim would be struck by an overwhelming mental and violently physical illness. As you may predict, the egg would hatch and the resulting tadpole would burst from the victim's chest, alien style. And this is how blue Slaad were born. The blue tadpole would grow into adulthood and take the form of the more powerful variant to the red Slaad. However, in the case where the red Slaad egg implantation was made on a particularly powerful spellcaster, the resulting tadpole would instead be a green Slaad tadpole and grow into the magically adept green Slaad. At this point, you may be asking how the red Slaad came to be, and you may suspect that similarly to the red Slaad, the blue Slaad would have claws with an egg gland that instead created red Slaad tadpoles. And if that's what you thought, you would be absolutely wrong. As a matter of fact, red Slaad didn't even grow from tadpoles at all. Instead, the blue Slaad would scratch a victim with its claws, and these people would be afflicted by a magical disease known as chaos phage. Chaos phage would then, within a period of days to months, drain away the personal essence of the victim, turning them into somewhat of a withered husk of a person, even disposing them of their personality. At the height of the disease, the phage would then turn them into a red Slaad in a process that resembled lycanthropy. Well, unless of course the victims were spellcasters or particularly powerful individuals. Can you guess what they would turn into in that case? If you guessed green Slaad, you would be, well, right in this case. The red and blue Slaad didn't particularly get along with one another, but I suppose in some ways you can look at them as an alien reproductive paradigm that isn't anything similar to the gendered reproductive cycle we're used to. The green Slaad were biologically similar to the other Slaad in terms of how they came to be. However, as mentioned before, their host must be a particularly talented individual. Furthermore, the green Slaad have the possibility of metamorphosing into gray Slaad. After a long period of time, ranging from years to over a century, a green Slaad would instinctively learn important information, allowing them to transform into the more powerful gray Slaad. The green Slaad would go off into a pilgrimage of sorts, going into isolation in Limbo, most likely dying and being absorbed back into the chaos. However, sometimes after a period of about a year, they would complete their transformation, returning as the slightly shorter but more powerful gray Slaad. And at this point, if you guessed that there was yet another Slaad transformation, you would be correct. The gray Slaad could further transform into the indistinguishable but notably different Death Slaad. Gray Slaad could become Death Slaad by either eating a dead Death Slaad if they had the opportunity to take the easy route, but more likely they would perform a ritual that infused them with negative energy, turning them evil in the process. The new chaotic evil creature was a Death Slaad, now imparted with a drive to cause pain and suffering for its own gain, or just for the fun of it. However, once more, the Death Slaad was not the final form of the Slaad. In an unlikely scenario, a Death Slaad could undergo another pilgrimage similar to the one that turned them into a gray Slaad when they began as a green. The Death Slaad would go into solitary isolation for a period of a year, and when they returned, they would be a white Slaad. But, yet again, if the white Slaad repeated the same process after a period of another century, they could become a black Slaad. The black Slaad were notably different from other Slaadi, however. Having lost its physical form to the abyssal forces of entropy, the resulting creature was a physical void in space, appearing as a humanoid darkness similar to their former toad-like physical form. This unlikely form was the final known form of the Slaadi, only eclipsed by the Slaad Lords in power, who were deity-like Slaad who ruled over Limbo prior to the appearance of the familiar common Slaad we are going over in this video. The Slaad Lords only need mentioning in passing, as their forms were nothing similar to the Batrachian aberrations we've discussed thus far, ranging from a creature that resembles a two-headed troglodyte to a giant golden amoeba, adding yet more confusion to the matter of the Slaad life cycle. On top of the egg plantation and phage spreading methods, the Slaadi also had mating seasons that specifically tie them to their home in Limbo, the Spawning Stone. Each Slaad race has their own mating season, which progresses incrementally through the races, ending with the powerful Death Slaad, who will eventually be pushed out by the overwhelming number of Red Slaad for fear of being implanted with an egg themselves. Yes, that was possible too. During the mating seasons, the hermaphroditic Slaad would mate with Slaad of the same races, and the egg pellets of the Red Slaad would be fertilized, while the, wait a sec, I'm not really sure how the phage-inflicting Slaad fit into this, but they did have their own mating seasons as well. I guess they fertilized the, chaos phage or something? Well, in any case, this neatly wraps up the Slaad life cycle. Or maybe neatly was the wrong choice of words here. Part 3. Slaad Society. Slaad were the surviving native inhabitants of the first layer of Limbo, aptly referred to as Gith and Slaad, for being the home of the Slaad as well as the immigrant Gethzeri. It was likely that with the coming into being of the Slaad as a substantial race, the other enclaves that might have once existed in the first layer of Limbo were consumed by the chaotic Slaad. Slaad were the living embodiment of chaos, which is already somewhat problematic of a description and requires further clarification. The Spawning Stone brought a tepid sort of order to the Slaad, with two prevailing theories explaining its inclusion in Limbo. Firstly, that it was created by the Slaad Lords, particularly Sendem or Igor, to bring a controlled and subdued form to the Slaad. The Slaad Lords recognized that the nature of pure chaos meant that eventually a chaotic being would come into existence who rivaled or surpassed their own power, and as such the Spawning Stone was a creation that could subdue the chaos by limiting the Slaad to their familiar Batrachian forms. How the Slaad appeared or existed prior to the Spawning Stone isn't entirely known. The other main theory is that the Spawning Stone was created by Primus, the ruler of Mechanus and the orderly races of Modrons. As a greater being of godlike power and agent of order among the planes, Primus sought to bring a sense of order to the disordered beings formed out of the chaos of Limbo, and so the Spawning Stone was his solution. As such, the Spawning Stone seemingly confines the Slaad to a semi-predictable frog-like form. However, the chaos nevertheless still comes through, and no two Slaad are alike as a result. However, the importance of the Spawning Stone to Slaad society is imperative and paramount, functioning as the central settlement for all Slaad kind. The stone was a somewhat horseshoe-shaped enormous monument, large enough to contain castles or towns within it. As one might predict, the result of its importance to the Slaad meant that Slaad towns existed for times inside the Spawning Stone. However, the inherent desire for chaos meant that orderly congregations such as towns could not exist forever, and so the ruins of former towns would often be found floating away from the Spawning Stone in various states of decay and reabsorption into the chaos of Limbo. Whatever it was about the Spawning Stone that caused order in the Slaad also restricted them to their mating seasons, and said season was restricted to the vicinity of the Spawning Stone, perhaps limiting their reproductive cycle as a result. Though the Slaadi were far too disorganized to follow the commands of others for long, they nevertheless recognized a loose power-based hierarchy among their own kind, with the more powerful races outranking the weak and the powerful Death Slaad as the apex of the loose Slaad society. You may wonder where white and black Slaad fit into this, and the easiest answer is they don't. Far surpassing the other Slaad, and existing in such small numbers, they existed apart from all other Slaad kind, with creatures of their own kind sometimes not even recognizing them to be Slaad. The Death Slaad, as the most powerful race of Slaad, were the de facto leaders of the Slaad races. On occasion, the Death Slaad would also organize the Lesser Slaad into larger numbers at the behest of the Slaad Lord Igor in order to spread entropy and chaos throughout the realms. Slaad would also organize in order to invade settlements of the lower realms and prime material plane, in order to find victims for egg and phage incubation. Sometimes they would capture humanoids from the other realms, bringing them back to the spawning stone, where they would be imprisoned until the resulting Slaad were born. As such, it wasn't out of the ordinary to find other races in the vicinity of the spawning stone, however, not of their own volition. There was one more strange conceit to the chaos of Slaad society. The gems implanted in the brains of the Slaad who came into contact with, or were willed into existence by the spawning stone. Yeah, that was a thing too. Are you surprised? Anyway, these Slaad who found themselves near the spawning stone would receive a magical gem implanted into their brains. The gems contained their life forces, and were in fact tiny fragments of the spawning stone. Upon somehow seizing said gem, either by surgical or magical means, the Slaad associated with the gem would be controlled up to the point of having to fulfill 3 requests. On fulfilling the requests, the Slaad would then be freed from control. This method of control did, however, pose a risk, as the controller would be targeted by other Slaad in the nearby vicinity. The reality is, the best social strategy for dealing with the Slaad at all was complete and total avoidance. Part 4. Closing. To conclude, the Slaad are a very interesting group of chaotic frog-like races, with a lot of opportunity for homebrewing thanks to their randomness. Their very nature of reproducing also adds a certain element of sinister reality to any campaign that wishes to use them, and the opportunity of turning them into disorganized big bad evil guys is also there for any level of campaign, as the variants fill a wide variety of spectrum of challenge ratings. They're one of my personal favorite enemy races, although I do have a soft spot for aberrations in general. There's something about the transition from one Slaad variant to the next that makes them, in my opinion, ideal for character growth as a villain, or even minor villain to a campaign, making them a great antagonist overall, and one that isn't necessarily evil throughout the entirety of the campaign, but nevertheless could pose a serious threat. The only thing that I think is missing is that this would be a good candidate race to impose a table for random mutations. Instead of having to homebrew all of the randomness, throwing in a D20 or D100 chart for variations of Slaad would streamline them as a unique race with lots of opportunity to add uniqueness. But in any case, we shall put the Slaad back into Limbo for now as we wrap this up. I hope you enjoyed this dive into the Slaad, and look forward to the next deep dive video on Forgotten Realms lore. Till next time, folks, have fun and stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye!